Tonight we'll be starting with Stephen Sklar, who's right up front here. Wave your hand. He's a Henry George teacher and attorney in immigration law in New York City and New Jersey. And he'll be speaking on the thing once seen cannot be unseen.
So welcome. We're all basically here in this space today because 150 years ago, Henry George had an insight. The year is 1869, not that long after the end of the Civil War, and around the time of the closing of the American frontier with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The place is the hills outside San Francisco. George has returned recently from a trip to New York City where he saw immense wealth literally side by side with abject poverty. And the contrast basically clarified in his mind the nature of a puzzle. Namely, how can it be that poverty persists and even deepens as civilization gets better and better able to produce wealth? So that moment of insight, George is out riding on horseback, he's taking a break, and he runs across a passing teamster, and for lack of anything better to say, he asks the man what land is worth around there. The man points to a field rather far off, and he says, well, I don't know exactly, but there's a man over there who will sell you land for $1,000 an acre, which was a huge sum in those days. George says, like a flash, it came upon me that there was the reason of advancing poverty amid advancing wealth. As population grows, land increases in value, and people must pay more for the privilege of using it. I turned away amidst quiet thought, he says, to the perception that came to me then and has been with me ever since. Well, I'll say, it changed his life. Basically, from that moment forward, he goes from being a locally known journalist and starting to make a name for himself in California to being a household name around the world. He, in the years following that moment of central insight, he works out in his head and in books and in writing a whole system and series of insights about the workings of the economic world, centered around the idea that land monopoly and the institution of private property and land that makes it possible is the injustice at the heart of the poverty problem. His books sell in the millions of copies, which would be remarkable today, but was even more remarkable back then. He attracts to his ideas and his thinking prominent people of the day, such as Leo Tolstoy, the great Chinese statesman Sun Yat-sen, Albert Einstein was an admirer, and on and on. He continues to be a household name until well after his death, towards the middle of the 20th century, although it's true that he's hardly known in the general population today. And it's true that, as George said, his experience of this central moment of insight for him was like seeing and solving a kind of a picture puzzle where suddenly a face emerges from a pattern that before made no sense. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Well, this has been my experience also with my contact with George's writing. I was introduced to George when I was a teenager. My parents were admirers of his writing. My father taught the Progress in Poverty course at the George School in New York for 17 years, and I took his course when I was in high school. I was a typical self-absorbed teenager, not particularly interested in social problems, but I noticed one effect of even then of reading George's writings almost immediately was that I could no longer respect even the best of economic credentials if the economists involved didn't have some fundamental understanding of the importance of land monopoly to the workings of an economy. It couldn't have been more than a year or so after I first read Progress in Poverty that I was at a dinner in Hanover, New Hampshire. My college roommate had invited me up there for the holidays. His father was a professor at Dartmouth, and one of the people at that dinner table was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, the chief exponent of the so-called Chicago School of Economics, and a man who several years after that dinner would go on to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. And as I listened to Friedman talking at the dinner table, because he didn't seem to have any fundamental awareness of the great importance of land policy and land monopoly in economics, it was clear to me that the man didn't know what he was talking about. Make of that what you will. Another way that the thing once seen can't be unseen in my relationship to having read George is that I can't regard things as the culprits in the poverty problem. Things like technology or labor-saving devices. When you read George, it becomes clear that we do have a tendency, as George points out, to somewhat overvalue the idea of jobs. Of course, we need jobs, we need employment, but the point of work is not to work for work's sake. That's not what we really want. What we want is to produce the goods and services that we need to work in order to produce. And so if you have inventions, if you have machinery that makes it easier to produce those things, that can only be a benefit to mankind. And it's other factors, such as unjust monopoly, that rob us of the benefit of those advances. And similarly, from George, I get the idea that trade is inherently beneficial to all parties to a trade. It's basically very much the case if you think of a person in upstate New York grows apples and a person in Florida grows oranges, and they exchange these things. On both sides of that trade, one person is giving up something that's relatively easy for them to produce in return for getting something that's relatively difficult for them to produce. Both parties to a trade are the beneficiaries of that. And George points out that this is exactly the essential nature even of international trade. And so from reading George, I understand that the idea that you can help an economy through tariffs and restricting trade is inherently nonsense. Another type of thing once seen that I can't unsee from having been exposed to George is the idea that people are not the culprit when it comes to the poverty problem. Population is not the reason that poverty persists and deepens as civilization advances. George pointed out, he debunked the Malthusian theory and the tendency which still exists in a lot of people's minds today to sort of blame human nature and nature for the persistence of poverty, whereas George says it's an entirely human behavior and institutions that we can change that are responsible. Another thing that George has helped me see is that wages do not depend on a fixed sum of capital. This was called the wages fund theory for anybody who wants to be nerdy about economics. And George basically debunked that, showing the real nature of the production of wealth really depends much more on labor and only as a sort of convenience and way station on capital. A sort of corollary to all that is that immigration, as George ultimately pointed out, like trade, is inherently beneficial to all parties involved, the person who migrates and the country that the person ends up in. Now, this is a subject that's dear to me because my day job for the last 25 years is practicing immigration law. But, it's sort of interesting that George, at the beginning of his career, before he had that moment of central insight, basically subscribed to the wages fund theory. He read John Stuart Mill, and he believed in those types of conventional theories before he had his moment of insight. But later in life, he came to understand that immigration is not a threat to a domestic workforce. And he made this clear in a number of places, including recently I was reading in archives of his work, in articles he wrote in the late 1880s. He says that immigration is really like trade and it should be free and open. But I'm sorry to bring up a fact, and I apologize in advance, that I recently, reading in archives, because I was interested to do that, at the New York Public Library and elsewhere, I sort of reconnected with the fact that George's wholehearted advocacy for the idea of having no restrictions on immigration he only aimed that at European immigration. And looking out over you from what I'm about to say, I could wish that there were a little bit darker colored faces, or maybe a bunch of Chinese people, but the fact is that George seems to have been against and in favor of restricting immigration in his day from China and from Africa. And I'm really sorry to report that that seems to have been kind of on, well, it was partly on religious grounds, partly on cultural grounds, and partly on racial grounds. I have struggled with this. I kind of stumbled across it again 10 days ago as I'm getting ready to give this talk. And I'm thinking, first of all, this is difficult for me personally because of my day job. I have two things in my life that are important to me in social areas. One is Henry George. I've admired his writing for probably getting close to 50 years now. And for 25 years, I've been a wholehearted immigration lawyer. Strangely enough, there are many immigration lawyers, probably not the majority of them, who seem to kind of favor various restrictions on immigration, but I'm not one of those. I basically managed to calm down about this odd thing in George's history, but to put things in a more positive light and not kill the buzz tonight and keep it in a celebratory mode for the man I greatly admire, Henry George, I will say that I found it heartening to discover in the New York Public Library archives of the Henry George collection a letter to George from a contemporary and a colleague of his, a man named William Lloyd Garrison Jr., a letter dated December 4th, 1893, calling George out on this and reminding him that the entire bent of all of his insights and so much of his writing is essentially humanistic and universalist. And for him to take a stance that was anti-Chinese immigration at the time really was in conflict with the spirit that so many people were starting to admire about George's writing, which is that we should really work towards the equality of rights for all human beings. I have not yet found in any archive any answer from George, but I take heart from the fact not only that there was a contemporary who happened to be working very much with George on the Georgist movement, on the single tax remedy. Garrison was a big advocate for that, and George and Garrison continued their correspondence even well after they recognized that they were on opposite sides of the Chinese immigration question. As another thought I have, to not leave it as a downer, I think that if George were alive today, which would be nice but kind of surprising, he was an amazing man, but 180, that's a tough gig. But if he were around today, I think I think it's extremely likely that he would find, to his surprise and ultimately, I think, delight, that we have become, after he died, the wonderful melting pot that we are. And there is a lot more of multiculturalism and vibrancy to the fact that we have people from some of the countries where he feared that immigration would be a bad idea. Just another example, I think, of a very short list of the world's most brilliant people not being able to see everything. But back to the things once seen that I can't unsee, I want to end by saying that George was, thanks to him, I'm more aware than I would otherwise be that land monopoly, private property in land, really is the source of injustice that is at the heart of the poverty problem. I want to say that there's a piece of land in Milburn, New Jersey, one town away from the town I live in, Maplewood. It's the old Saks Fifth Avenue building. It's a large department store that's sitting there with an even larger parking lot. The town is thickly settled. It's about 19 miles west of New York City. And that piece of land has been sitting there vacant and unused. You can't even use the parking lot for parking because there's a chain across it. The parking lot is only good for growing grass up between the cracks. It's been sitting there unused for at least 25 years. It's owned by a private corporation. The Ahold Corporation is the main owner. They're headquartered in Holland. And the fact is that although town planning boards every now and then think that something should be done about this, nothing can be done easily because legally, under our system of land ownership, Ahold owns it. So I want to say that it doesn't take an expert in Henry George, and you don't have to have mastered his writings, to know that there's something wrong there. But because I have read George, I am acutely aware that to have that much land in that location, that long out of use, is an outrage and works a terrible detriment to the economy of the local community. So not to end on a note of outrage, I just want to finish by saying, and I said I would finish before, but now I really have. So now you know I'm not to be trusted. Why did I say that? But in any event, I want to say that I am happy, I'm really grateful to have been introduced to George many years ago, to be able to read him and reread him over the years. I'm happy to be teaching at the George School for the last several years, because I'm really happy to feel like I'm on the team with people like William Lloyd Garrison Jr. and the fine people I met at the George Conference in Pittsburgh recently, and the other people who will be speaking tonight, to do what we can to keep the flame of George's ideas alive in the world. Thank you.
About 2 minutes for a couple of questions.
How many minutes?
Couple.
Five. Okay. If there are any questions about, it doesn't have to be about Henry George, but that would be kind of appropriate. Anything I said, anything you're thinking of? Yes, go ahead.
When you mentioned how George was in San Francisco, in that area in Oakland,
Right.
looking out over the bay,
Right.
and this idea came to you, what that brought
To him.
him,
Yes.
what that brought to mind was my own perspective on looking out over the Bay Area recently after my father and mother died and having to sell their property, and the ridiculous amount of money that I got for that property, and also the fact that my nieces and nephews who still live in the area, there is no way they can afford to buy any property there. And there also is this situation where if you have a house like my parents' was, which was needed extensive renovations, it's very difficult to find workers to do those renovations because they can't live in the area. And now in San Francisco, there's dire poverty with homeless people living on the streets. It's a very different place than when I grew up. And there are places you just don't even want to go into the city anymore because of, you know, the poor people who are on the street, the smell, the, you know, no sanitary facilities. It's really terrible. So I'm just kind of picturing that area and that view of the San Francisco Bay and that area that George saw in the situation that's there now.
Well, what you're saying makes me think of the fact that I think in the sort of system of land policy that we've had for hundreds of years now, it's very hard to separate oneself from the difficulties that produces. We're also interconnected. So I think of the fact that I too, you know, when we moved from Millburn to Maplewood, we sold the house in Millburn. A couple of years after we bought it, we made $100,000 profit, and it was nothing that we did. It was because New Jersey Transit had put in a line to Midtown Direct to New York City. So it was the community and the infrastructure that gave us that windfall. And just like you, I'm sure, we were very happy. It was the easiest $100,000 I ever made. And it's a sore temptation to do that over and over again. But if you think about the other side of it, rents have constantly risen. Say in New York City, I used to live on 75th Street in Columbus, paid $250 a month that same exact studio apartment today would be over $2,000. And somebody doing the kind of work I was doing then, I was making $19,000 a year doing computer services stuff, there's no way that they could live anywhere near New York City. So, I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but it's just that that's how widespread the issue is. That's my response. Anything else, or have I beaten you into submission? Yes, go ahead.
Where are there places where this is being tried now? You must know there's some places where at least some element of land value taxation is at least being explored, maybe not in the fullness of New Jersey's idea, but at least being tried to some extent.
Well, I am a lucky man standing before you because coupled with the fact that I'm relatively ignorant about practical stuff like that, being much more interested in theory due to a flaw in my personality. The very good news is that you have Mike Curtis and Josh Vincent are going to be speaking, and they will brilliantly address them. Okay, that's good.